I am an architect's daughter and grew up in a world of paper, drawings, sketches, pens, pencils, all of that. And majority part of my parents' friends, they were left-wing Finnish architects, radical idealists of their own time. People who really wanted to change the world of 1960s, abandon the old heroes and discover the new ones. And that was really a new world in the making. Well, that was one part. Another part was from my grandfather's house, where I discovered completely different kind of world. So this is to illustrate the world of the architecture. Actually, it's from the Aalto studio. My grandfather, he was a professor of art history. He specialized in wooden church architecture, and he was a great friend of Alvar Aalto's. They shared an interest to vernacular architecture. The use of materials, art history and tradition. This is from the Muuratsalo Experimental House's sauna, and the next one is from just a use of stone close to Saunatsalo Municipal House. The use of materials was something that was very relevant in their discussions between Alvar Aalto and my grandfather. He told that sometimes the phone rang in the middle of the night when Aalto wished to get a second opinion. And that was really his method of working, sharing and testing ideas with the others. And I grew up understanding some of this, the process of creation that starts really from the idea, and finally, after hundreds of drawings, a massive amount of negotiations, at times compromises, and at times, of course, numerous bottles of red wine, the process reaches the goal and new fantastic buildings see the daylight. Well, later on, as a museum director and a museologist, I got Alvar Aalto Museum into my hands, and I began to think that what is the story that a museum tells and mediates? That's something I've been digesting a lot due to my current job, and that's also something I wish to share with you today, the story, the narrative, and its building blocks. So instead of, let's say, telling you about the houses of which you are going to see the films about, I'm going to tell about the context. And the question is really that how Aalto has been discussed and displayed and why, and how does this aesthetics apply to the ways of representation. As you probably know, Alvar Aalto's life achievements have been presented in numerous exhibitions and collection displays, both at the Alvar Aalto Museum, Finland, and other venues all around the world. In Aalto's case, the material to work with is exceptionally rich. Architecture, design, and even paintings provide a great variety of material that allow access to in-depth understanding of the essence of Aalto's work. And in order to understand and even challenge the Alvar Aalto canon of its display, we need to be aware of its origins and formation, and that's something that I'm trying to open up in the forthcoming half an hour or so. So what I will do is that I will cast a look into his design approach concerning the environments of display, pay attention to the link between the retrospective exhibitions and the formation of iconic works, and finally discuss a little bit the general aesthetics of displays. And probably one of my key assumptions is that Aalto himself affected a lot to the aesthetics and the contents of narration. And this is a very, very interesting notion, because if you then compare, let's say, with the other architects of his own time, this is probably something that you want to take on board and analyze. So that he himself was part of the creation of the language, let's say. And one of the features when I have been looking into this question is that I have been trying to figure out that what has been included to the story and what has been left out. That's always really, really interesting. And one of the issues is that what are our expectations as visitors, guests, readers, audience members, looking at the films and so on. Alvar Aalto's architecture attracts tens of thousands of visitors every year, and his career, in retrospect, is a signature career of a change maker. He was born in 1898, when Finland was still part of Russia. Architects and designers of his time, they were inspired by national romanticism, Art Nouveau and Jugendstil. Then Finland became independent in 1917, and as you can easily imagine, the aspirations of a young nation were reflected in the national style. That was very heavy, but that's another story. But that's important to understand, because when Aalto began his studies in the late 1910s, he was deeply inspired by classical Italian architecture. And this is an example of his early period, a house he built in the middle of the city of Jyväskylä in 25. But quite soon after that, his language got simpler and clearer. It's his own home that was finalized in mid-30s. And from here already you can see how form really followed function. Just to explain very briefly, this is a photo taken from the backyard of the house. And from the building you can actually see how his studio, that was housed in his private house to begin with, was in the white part of the building, and then in the middle there was the living room that was sort of shared area for the guests and the family, then the dining space, and upstairs all the bedrooms and so on. So the division from the public to the semi-private to the private, and you could sort of figure it out from the outside of the building. And by doing so, he introduced a new kind of architecture and design philosophy together with his first wife, Aino Aalto, who is a very, very important figure when analyzing Aalto's work. Aino Aalto did majority part of the work together with Alvar Aalto, and she had her own specialty in designing textiles, glassware, and furniture. And they were of an opinion that good design was for everyone. Together, represented the articulated need to create well-designed environments for all. And Alvar Aalto ended up planning buildings for several cities and countries all around the world, and setting up also a retail business for the design objects. And that was the company which name is Artek, that was founded in 1935. Alvar Aalto got his inspiration from traditional building techniques, the use of wood and stone that was referred to earlier, the history of architecture, Bauhaus and the new painting, nature, light, people, and he loved stories. And he became the modernist architect who extended his design ideology to smallest details, such as door handles, which is probably my favorite examples, and there's an example of that. This is from the Maison Louis Carré, close to Paris. And he had a very strong message to the rest of the world. It was all about well thought out environments for the benefit of the people, and it was all about human scale. And that's something that's it can be physically felt when you enter an Aalto building, no matter whether it's a small house or a big public space. It sort of resonates really well to your body. You feel immediately at home in the space. I have no idea how he did the trick, but it works. So, now I'm moving on to the next chapter, let's say, of my presentation, thinking about how all of this, how his work was then exhibited, because he not only planned and designed, but he also exhibited his work from early on, and the most famous examples derive from the world fairs, such as you can see here, the one in Paris in 1937, where his famous Savoy vase was exhibited for the first time, or the next one, which is also equally famous, New York in 1939. And these world fairs provided Alvar Aalto a very multi-leveled platform. He could now master at all levels, from the scale of an entire house to the object on display. And it's quite rare for an architect, a designer, to be able to take care of all these elements all together. And why I mention it now is because that this language of presentation and display was something that remained for several decades. What's also interesting is that his interest in motive display showed also in his numerous entries for museum buildings. All in all, he made a surprising amount of 11 plans, out of which 4 were realized. And in the following, I have some examples. The first one is a very, very early design for Bernia Museum that was never realized, but this indicates his devotion to the classical Italian architecture. This is from 1928. And later on, his characteristic handwriting and style took over, and the designs relate to the well-known family of Aalto buildings. The next 2 examples feature also unrealized plans, such as this Baghdad Fine Arts building that was from 1957, and Shiraz Art Museum from 1969. And the last example of the museum buildings I have chosen here is the realized one, which is the Alvar Aalto Museum in Jyväskylä that was built in 1971. One of those buildings you might all know that belong to this category is the wooden pavilion he designed for Giardini in Venice. That's the little wooden blue building that you probably, all of you who have visited either the Fine Arts Biennale or the Architectural Biennale, you have been there, I can guarantee. It was at first planned to be a temporary building, but it's still there. And not very long ago, actually there was a heavy tree that fell during a storm and broke the roof and part of the walls. And now last year, it was beautifully restored and reopened for the Architectural Biennale. Well, the point here is, by showing you the world fairs and also the museum plans, is that he grew quickly into a designer of all-embracing settings of display. He experimented with exhibitions and developed aesthetics that went well hand in hand with his own work. And to my understanding, he actually created a language that has been very, very hard to break. And in the following, I will cast a look at that. Think about the idea of Aalto that you have in your heads. How has it been constructed? Is it by visiting the sites? By looking at photos, reading texts? By visiting exhibitions, looking at films? Listening to the stories told by his colleagues, friends, or probably enemies? Or is it a combination of all of this? Because if you think about a strong image of an architect and designer, of course the story emerges from somewhere, and then you have to trace what are the building blocks. And now I'm going to concentrate on one of those, because I'm not going to lecture here for 4 hours. I promised to limit it to very condensed time. So I chose exhibitions, which is probably one of the most influential tools in terms of most modes of presentation and creation of narratives. In Alvar Aalto's case, his life work has gained attention in the form of retrospective exhibitions. In Finland, the first major retrospective was organized at the Atheneum Art Museum as early as 1967. And the exhibition catalogue, which is actually here, included Leonardo Mosso's listing of Aalto's work between 1918 until 1967. And the importance of such an exhibition was praised in the press, and Aalto was recognized as one of the nation's masters. And of course, for a good reason. He was at the time a very, very well-established international architect that was featured in publications such as Nikolaus Pevsner's book, An Outline of European Architecture, that was printed already in 1943, or Siegfried Gideon's A Decade of New Architecture from 1951. Not to mention several other books, magazines and journals. And these publications, together with the major exhibitions, formed our understanding of what was considered especially valuable in his work. And it's quite interesting to note that such pieces as these here, Viborg Library and Paimio Sanatorium, and then the following one, which is Villa Mairea, quickly gained position as key works that needed always to be exhibited. And this is due to the fact that from very, very early on, these sites were printed everywhere. And that was partly thanks to Alvar Aalto's exceptionally great networking skills. He knew everybody. And the people he did not know, he went and said hello, and then they were, friends forever. So that was the system, that was how it worked. Of course, later on, the list of the top sites was completed with several other important sites, as his home, which is the next slide, his studio, which you will see in the film, and experimental house, which is in the next slide, just to mention some of the examples. The first major retrospective at the Atheneum, now we can change the slide, this is a portrait of him, included all elements of Alvar Aalto's work, from buildings to design objects, as well as experimental reliefs and paintings. And now thinking about the 60s, the typical mode of display continued the tradition once learned from the world fairs. Design objects communicated at their best when set on the stage. Black and white photo panels of buildings, drawings and small-scale models provided an overview to the buildings. And this tradition lived fairly long. I picked one example. This is from Alvar Aalto Museum's collection display from 1978. And this is a follow of that tradition from the world fairs to the retrospective exhibitions and to the collection displays. What's interesting here is that general context, the author's professional or personal networks or sources of inspirations were more or less invisible. They were not included to this object-orientated story. And museums, as platforms of display, were rather static venues, and the exhibitions were presented as statements rather than openings for wider debates. And of course, there's a huge difference compared to the contemporary practices. Well, the next big-scale retrospective was organized by the Museum of Finnish Architecture, and that was displayed in 1978, which was like 2 years after Alvar Aalto's death. And the story has, of course, continued in several contexts. I'm not going to feature all of them, but I pick one example. One of the bigger entries in Finland was organized by Design Museum in 2004. The exhibition was called Alvar Aalto, Master of Functionalism, and that was described as a must-see. Now we can take the next slide. Hannu Pöppönen, who is the critic for the biggest daily newspaper, he noted the following, and now I read a quotation. Alvar Aalto's design has never been displayed as extensively as it is at the exhibition. At the Design Museum, this is done separately from his architectural works, which make it easier to examine Aalto's development as a designer. He wrote from furniture with influences of classicism via Art Deco to functionalism and to the time that followed. End of quotation. Well, I chose this quotation because it's a key quotation in terms of explaining us that what the expectations are. And we could pay attention to the critic's wish to get an extensive overview to Aalto's design production, explore not only the usual but unusual items, and hear Aalto's own voice. He thanks the museum for the rarely shown prototypes and points out their role as patches of the gaps in the great story. So, to my mind, this example showcases beautifully the usual set of visitor expectations. Firstly, the audience needs to see the signature works, or classics if you like, such as the much beloved Savoy vase and the three-legged stool, which are in the following slide. Secondly, they need to see rarities in order to truly explore Aalto's design. And thirdly, the audience expect to see the whole story, a feature that derives from the history of Hegelian display practices once created in the 19th century. And finally, the visitors appreciate if they can see and hear Alvar Aalto himself or read his thoughts in one form or another. And this in turn, of course, brings Alvar Aalto closer to the public. So, when analyzing these different exhibitions, the four features I just mentioned, they are always there. Signature works, rarities, the attempt to capture the whole story, as well as bringing the visitors and Aalto closer together by making anecdotes and stories visible. Aalto has been widely exhibited worldwide, and from those examples I pick up two. The first one is a classical Aalto setup, whereas the second one represented a tryout for an alternative approach. And now we move on to New York. In 1998, Museum of Modern Art, New York, organized a major Aalto exhibition with the title Between Humanism and Materialism. This exhibition was curated by Peter Reed, and the exhibition included original drawings and models, new and archival photographs, fine examples of his furniture and glass, and 5 specially created video walkthroughs of Alvar Aalto's most important buildings, which of course at the time was a great technical novelty and innovation. Approximately 50 buildings and projects from all phases of Aalto's career, ranging from culture institutions to factories, apartment buildings, libraries, town halls and churches, were represented. And there are 2 more slides from the exhibition, so you can get the idea of how the exhibition display looked like that. And then another kind of approach. In 2007, in Barbican, London, Barbican hosted an Aalto exhibition. Now we can take that slide, now curated by architect Schijndel House. And this was a clear attempt to present Aalto in the contemporary context. Schijndel House, as one of the great admirers of Aalto's work, borrowed his aura to the exhibition context. He created an embracing frame for Aalto's work, frame that was clearly recognizable from top to bottom. This fresh approach gained lots of media attention, and I chose one quotation from the whole lot. This is Dan Hill, who wrote in City of Sound the following, and this is the beginning of the quotation. Both architects represent ongoing attempts at connecting the vernacular, situated and sustainable with the progressive, the innovative and the modern. Okay, that was a good start, but then he became critical. He claimed that, and this is a quotation, the Barbican's exhibition is too withdrawn, recessive in presentation, a solid, unspectacular response, perhaps attempting to allow the numerous original drawings and models to breathe. And then he said that there's frustratingly little attempt to explore the work in real detail. And then he continued by explaining that I would like exhibitions to explain more. They exist to present a curated view of work, but also to explain this particular curation and the significance of the work. I would prefer them to be confident, unafraid of being didactic. I'd like an exhibition to overcompensate and let me decide when I had my fill. Spending £8 on the exhibition, you should walk away full of ideas, inspiration and knowledge. End of quotation. There's a sort of a clash with expectations, the contemporary and traditional. Well, all of these exhibitions that I picked up for today's presentation, of course they are children of their own time, and they have reflected the development of the exhibition design. And one should note that it was only around the turn of the millennium that the exhibitions became slightly, but not completely separated from the welfare tradition, offering alternative display strategies. More stories were now integrated, the context, the importance of the professional and personal networks, and the general human aspects were discovered. And this is, of course, more or less due to the fact that our relation to the history has altered. It has changed. Instead of the master narrative, there are several stories, counter-narratives, and sub-narratives, voices that need to be heard. Well, I began my talk with a very personal notion, and that's something I will also finish my presentation with a personal notion. And thinking about that, I would continue talking about grandparents. When my grandparents, wished to build a house for the family, they thought about asking Alvar Aalto to do the job, but then they hesitated. This was at the end of 1950s. Alvar Aalto was very, very busy with numerous commissions, and they ended up asking another friend, a Finnish modernist architect, Aulis Blomstedt, to do the job. And he designed a house which is nowadays a listed building. It's a building where I live with my family. Aulis Blomstedt had 4 sons. One of them became a really, really good painter. 2 of the sons became architects. And the 4th became a filmmaker, a documentarist, an essayist, a master of light and moving images. And of course, it's not very, very difficult to guess that who is the filmmaker, who is the director, who is the man behind the films that we are going to see tonight. It is Anssi Blomstedt. So when you look at the films, think about the mediation of space and ideas behind. Think about the narrator, the filmmaker, all those fantastic stories, and the voice of an architect's son. Thank you.